I like to think of that iceberg theory, right? That we can observe what's above the surface in terms of behaviors, in terms of language, maybe in terms of physical reactions, and that's just a fraction of actually what's happening. So when I envision being curious, I conjure up this image of the iceberg theory and invite myself within my parenting practice to remain open to what else might be happening.
Rachel Poirier is our guest today. She's a parent coach and school consultant with expertise in executive functioning, twice exceptionality, and neurodiverse learners. Her passion for working with families was born out of her 2 decades-long career in education, teaching and training teachers both in the United States and internationally, as well as her own unexpected parenting path. In this episode, she shares her approach to curious optimism and how you can develop a detective mindset for noticing and supporting your children's behavior and development.
I really like this topic of curiosity and curious optimism because it's available to all of us, I think, at any point within our parenting. And when we come to parenting, we often come with expectations. And those are with us from our own learning histories, sort of how we were raised and what we experienced as children and within our families. And these expectations, I think, also come to us from what we've observed with friends and with neighbors and sort of societal narratives. Um, and and if we are faced with realities that maybe don't match our expectations, it can be tricky for us as parents. And so I think curiosity is a really, really wonderful way to shift shift narratives that may be preconceived or that we may not even be aware that we bring to our parenting practice. So it's a really beautiful invitation, I think, curiosity to make a shift, and it can shift dynamics within an interaction. It can shift entire relationships.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you talk about the preconceived ideas about how we should be as parents. I think probably all parents feel that to some degree, wherever it comes from.
Mm.
So, in contrast to that, what does it mean to be curious? What does that look like?
Mm. Yeah, I think it means sort of showing up, being willing to show up with a level of openness, and being open to different different perspectives and different interpretations of whether it's behavior or engagement with friends and with other people, engagement with different environments, school environments, maybe athletic environments. And I think it means being willing to ask why, not from sort of a perspective of why can't you do this? Why aren't you doing this? But a perspective of, wow, like, why is this hard for you? I notice that this is tricky for you. And I think particularly when our children are younger and maybe less able to articulate why something might be tricky from a sensory perspective or a learning perspective or a social perspective, we can sort of step in to bridge that gap by being curious detectives. And and I think that when this practice is established, when our children are younger, it really lends itself then to journeys of self-discovery for our children. And then as they age, they're better able to articulate why things don't feel good, and conversely, why things do feel good and why they thrive in particular environments.
Yeah, so what so what are the characteristics or traits or what are the feelings that somebody might experience as they're being curious? I like that word that you use, detective. So a detective, when I
Mm,
think of detective, I'm thinking of somebody who's maybe observing more than they're speaking, who's
mm,
watching for nonverbals as well as verbals, who's aware that maybe somebody's presenting differently than they might actually be feeling, that there might be more to the story. What does that mean to you?
Yes, I love how you described that, and I think that that's spot on. And I like to, if I'm conjuring a visual, I like to think of that iceberg theory, right? That we can observe what's above the surface, in terms of behaviors, in terms of language, maybe in terms of physical reactions, and that's just a fraction of actually what's happening. So when I envision being curious, I conjure up this image of the iceberg theory and invite myself within my parenting practice to remain open to what else might be happening. And I think this practice of questioning as well, gently questioning ourselves, what else might be going on? On the surface, I may see big behaviors. I may see some sassiness, perhaps. And and then I like to view it as my job to be that curious detective and ask myself, what else might be happening? What else might be happening on a sensory perspective, on a social perspective, on a physical perspective, an interoceptive perspective? And that can often, I think, soften our response and allow us the space to respond as opposed to react.
Yeah, I was just thinking when you were saying that it probably we're observing somebody else, but it changes our own thoughts and our own mannerisms and the way that we present. I'm sure when we shift into that detective mindset versus the drill sergeant or
Mhm.
helicopter parent or whatever it is kind of mindset where we're everything is outwards, we're actually taking things in. Maybe before we dive into some of the benefits of this approach and why children do well with it, uh, maybe you can just describe how a parent goes about becoming curious, developing that
Mhm.
mindset, and then the things that they can start doing to practice that.
Yeah, I love that question, because you're right. So much of it is allowing the space for us as parents to take the pause. And that's our work, right? That's our inner work. And I think that it can look different for every parent. Some parents like to have a mantra, maybe um, talking themselves through that question. What else might be going on? Maybe some parents do well with a visual, and on the refrigerator, there's a post-it of the iceberg. We can benefit from cues, environmental cues, just as much as our children can. And it is our practice from this perspective is providing the space for us to pause so that we can invite that curiosity. I think the curiosity can come from a pause. Does that make sense?
It does. It sounds like you're saying you have to remind yourself to be mind. It's kind of a mindfulness thing, right?
Yes, yes. I
And
yeah, I
so,
agree with that. Hmm.
and so
And
maybe using a image you said, putting on your fridge or on your screensaver, or having a mantra, or maybe even listening to like some detective soundtrack or music or something like anything to get
yeah.
into that frame of mind, right?
Yes, yes. And I think one of the keys, I love your idea about the screensaver because it's it's easy to talk about this when we're calm and when we're regulated and we're not observing big behaviors or big responses from our children. It's easy for us from a place of calm to sort of embrace this idea of being a curious detective. And we all know that when we are in a position of sort of heightened responses and reactivity, it can be really tricky for us to access the skill. So I think a key piece of inviting this curiosity as part of our parenting practice is exposing ourselves to it on multiple occasions, so logging into the computer and then seeing the picture of the iceberg. It's just a really nice invitation for us in moments of calm to remember to practice, looking beneath the surface and being a curious detective. And of course, we're going to get it wrong sometimes. Well, I put wrong in quotes. Of course, when our resources are feeling limited and we're feeling stretched thin, it may not be accessible to us to be a curious detective, and that's okay. because our children give us so many opportunities to practice. So we'll get another chance, even if we feel like we missed the mark in any given moment.
Is the iceberg image, is that what you use, or is there a particular detective from books or movies that you identify with?
That's a great question. There is not a particular detective that I identify with. Um, and, for me, what I found within my practice, it's not so much visual. It can be kind of a mantra, and I love that question for myself personally. What else might be happening? What else might be going on? But for me, a physical motion helps ground me in the moment. And I put both my hands over my chest. And that sort of gives me the opportunity to pause, to ground. I may or may not take a deep breath at that point. Um, and I find that physical response, when I can access it, brings me down.
So more of a kinesthetic approach for
Hmm.
you, whereas others
Hmm.
might use a auditory mantra or a visual picture or something like that. It
Hmm.
sounds like you just have to figure out what works for you, whatever brings you to that space.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I think it takes practice, and it may change as our children get older, and our responses change, and their behaviors and responses change. So I really like to encourage parents, exactly as you say, Andrew, to practice. It's okay to practice, and it's okay if you try something and it doesn't work. It doesn't mean the strategy doesn't work. It just means you haven't yet found what will work for you to invite the pause and to invite the curiosity.
So once you've paused and you found that mindset, are there some other um, action steps that parents can take to be more curious or to present as more curious?
Mm, yeah, that's a great question. And I think, yes, I think exactly as you say, the pause is the first step. And then depending on where our child is coming from, we can take a moment to validate. We can take a moment perhaps to set an expectation for behavior, because while we're talking about all of this, I really want to emphasize that all feelings can be welcome with with our children and within sort of their range of emotions, and that doesn't mean that all behaviors are welcome. So we can be curious and empathetic and validating while still holding those expectations for behavior and how our children will treat other people and how they'll speak to themselves. So I think from that point of curiosity, we can then potentially go in a direction of validation, of maybe just having some togetherness without talking. Maybe we go in a direction of gently reminding, I see you, I hear you, and this isn't how we're going to do this. This isn't how we're going to treat each other. So I think from that point of curiosity, there are then a lot of available options for us to take next.
Before we go into the next step, just briefly, do you have any specific tips or approaches that you recommend for how to validate kids that you share
Mhm.
with parents? Is there something that kind of like a top two ways to do that, or
Yes, yes. And so much of it is child dependent, because some children will really accept validation that's quiet, that doesn't involve a lot of words. Maybe it's just kind of a sympathetic face and a nod and maybe a murmur, to show that we see them and we're here with them. Some children will like maybe a little back rub or hand holding. Um, some children will appreciate hearing us say, "Gosh, I see why you're feeling that way. That must be so fill in the blank, frustrating, discouraging, whatever the case may be." So some children really appreciate that more verbal response. Some really appreciate the nonverbal, and I think it's very much child dependent and situationally dependent. So again, when we go back to sort of the beginning about being curious detectives, we will learn over time response or what form of validation will best serve our children in any given circumstance.
And the taking this approach again, it's supporting the child, but then it's also you're kind of correcting your own thought processes and mindset as you're doing this. So, okay, so
Mhm.
you pause, you can validate at that point.
Mm.
What else would you recommend to support your curiosity as a parent?
Mm. Yeah, I think I really like the strategy of when everyone returns to calm and everyone is feeling regulated, again, sort of outside of this moment of big feeling, asking our children, um, gosh, like that was really hard. I wonder why that felt so hard for you. Or really sort of inviting a conversation from our child's perspective about what made that moment or that situation so wobbly. Because then, as we gain more insight, it gives us a starting point from which to focus on skill building, right? So if the root of a dysregulated moment was some rigidity and some inflexibility, well, then that gives us a starting point from which to think about skill building
Okay, so pause, validate, ask some good questions, look for challenge
later.
areas, opportunities
Hmm.
for skill building.
Hmm.
So that's all great. Is there anything else related to being curious that you wanted to hit on? Um,
Well, I think too, a part of being curious, a benefit of being curious is that we can then potentially see patterns, right, in behavior or in responses. And again, that can give us insight into skill building. If we see that our child consistently at big birthday parties or community gatherings really struggles, then, and we see, and we give ourselves the time to pause and wonder why and to notice even that this is happening, then we can sort of dig deeper and think, well, why is this a sensory thing? Is it a physical thing in terms of space? Um is it an overexcitability? And when we find a pattern, it doesn't mean that we avoid birthday parties and community gatherings because those are parts of life that make things beautiful and rich, and we want our children to be able to participate in those events if they so choose. So the question then becomes, how can we sort of scaffold within these contexts to build skills? Right? So whether that's, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. So a parent who is curious will be less likely to react to those difficult moments in a child and make maybe the wrong assumption about why they're doing what they're doing and be more likely to gather some information, to note that, and then, as you said, to look for patterns so that these can actually be turned into skill building opportunities rather than another a lecture or don't do that or we're not going here anymore or that
Yeah.
kind of reaction.
Yeah. Or everybody loves birthday parties. We're going to the birthday party. This is what everyone does, at this age. Then maybe it turns into, wow, I notice, and this may or may not be, made explicit to your child, but within ourselves, we can just sort of notice, gosh, every group event ends in a meltdown. So I wonder, what's the sweet spot of time that my child can successfully and in a regulated way engage in these community events or these interactions? And so maybe we sort of back up and then say, okay, we have this invitation to this class birthday party, and we don't need to go for the whole time. We can go for the first, 20 minutes. Gosh, I noticed that every time the presents are opened, my child struggles. So you know what? We're going to make a plan to politely and quietly exit before the presents get opened. Whatever the case may be. I was working with a family recently. Is it okay if I give an example?
Of
Okay,
course.
yeah. Um, and their 4-year-old they had welcomed a new baby to the family, and they noticed that just recently their 4-year-old began, as they described it, just randomly and unpredictably screaming, just screaming within the home. Okay, so this behavior was sort of confined to the home, and it was very dysregulating for mom and very dysregulating for the new baby. Um, and the parents were just baffled. And they said, you know what, this has never happened before. We've never seen this. We don't know where this is coming from. Maybe there's some stress with the new baby, but it's just so random and it's so unpredictable. And as we sort of took a deeper dive into this behavior, we did in fact identify patterns. And we noticed, or mom was able to notice, gosh, now that we're talking about this, I see that it happens when he is sort of physically in a space not very close to me, and when he is sort of done with an activity and maybe unsure of what to transition to next, or there's not another available option for transition. So that was beautiful work identifying that. So now we can approach the situation from a skill building perspective. And we talked about potentially setting him up with a couple of activities in closer proximity to mom if she's cooking dinner or tending to the baby or something like that. And explicitly telling him, look, sweetheart, when you're done with the blocks, your coloring is up here on the table, all in proximity of mom. Remember, if you want to show me something, you can say, look, mom, as opposed to just the big loud scream. And important to note that this child is fully verbal, so meeting age expectations for receptive and expressive language. So he had the skills with which to communicate in sort of a more expected way with mom that wouldn't cause dysregulation for the baby.
Which of these, so you've covered pausing and kind of checking or getting into the right mindset, then validating and then noticing. In your experience with parents, is any one of those more difficult? I mean, are they, you know what I'm saying? Is there one that
Mm-hmm.
tends to trip people up or is more challenging than others?
Mm. That's such a good question. I don't know that I would say that there's one that tends to trip parents up more than others. I think, it can be easy sometimes to to kind of get pulled into over validating. And I think that again, within sort of the this framework that we're talking about of pausing, of noticing, of validating, that it's always so important to emphasize that all feelings are welcome. And that doesn't mean that all behaviors are welcome. So we can still, within this very loving, supportive, skill building, curious framework, maintain expectations for for how our children act.
Okay, this is awesome. I think probably most parents listening would, this kind of tracks. I would think, any parent who wants to support their child is thinking, okay, yeah, I need to do this, but here's maybe something I need to work on. Like I feel like maybe I'm good at validating and maybe I do
Mm.
notice, but I'm so distracted or I just can't remember to get into that mindset. I just need to really focus on the mindfulness piece, or maybe they're really mindful, but they're not really sure what to do in the moment. But yeah, so this is all help. This is great. Anything else about curiosity before?
Yeah, I think that was a beautiful summary. And I think to sort of wrap up our chat about curiosity, I would just encourage parents to have self-compassion as they are maybe working to implement this framework or pieces of this curious framework of kind of taking that pause and seeing what works for them in terms of being able to access that mindfulness that you mentioned. And so just being gentle with ourselves and exploring the process and knowing that as we do the work and as we practice, it does become more accessible, it does become easier, and ultimately strengthens our connections with our children because it positions us, when we're curious detectives, to work in partnership with our children. And our children have so much insight into what works for them and what doesn't work and why. And when we're open to collaborating with them while still holding that container for expectations within our family, But when we're open to that collaboration, it can just be so transformative for our relationships, so strengthening for our relationships with our children. So I just want to encourage parents to explore, and to find what works for them.
And then I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you do professionally, what kinds of clients you work with, what you work on, and how listeners can find you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Andrew. Um, so I'm a board certified behavior analyst, and ultimately, I teach parents to support their kids in more calm, confident, and connected ways. And I help kids grow their social, emotional, and academic skills. And my expertise really is in executive functioning, so that's a big focus of my work. And folks can find me on my website. I also have a monthly newsletter.
And go ahead, what is your website? And I'll put it in the show notes as well.
Yeah, thanks. It's peartreebx.com. Pear like the fruit, peartreebx.com.
And why did you pick the name Pear Tree?
My last name, Poirier, means pear tree in French.
And
Poirier is
then
French for pear tree.
that's awesome. Yeah, when we last talked, I thought that was so cool. And then do you work with clients virtually and in person? Because you're in Glenwood Springs, but
Mm.
what geographically do they need to be right there in your office, or how does that work?
They do not need to be right in my office. I am based in Glenwood Springs, and I do work virtually with clients all over the world.
Thank you very much for coming on. We really appreciate it. That's it from us today. As always, you can find more information as well as resources on our website, individualmatters.org. We hope you'll join us at the next podcast, where we'll continue to explore topics around successful living, learning and education, and child development, and share ways to help you live a more positive and fulfilling life.
The preceding information is not intended to provide or serve as medical, clinical, or educational advice. Individual Matters is not responsible for the accuracy of guest statements. All information should be validated independently. Please consult with your doctor, mental health provider, attorney, or other appropriate professionals before making any personal decisions for yourself or those in your care.